what we've said is that at Har Sinai, God gave over Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Right.
And to Moshe. And then we said this is how Torah Sheba'al Peh was passed on. The key to understanding this view of revelation is that there was a Torah Sheba'al Peh. That is a fundamental principle of Torah Judaism. That revelation was not just the book, the 5 books of Moses. Revelation was Torah Sheba'al Peh. The difficulty that then ensues is a description of what is this Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that's really, really difficult to fully describe because because what is Torah Sheba'al Peh is not finite. It's not like a concrete item. It's an item, it's an entity that is dynamic. And that is perhaps the hardest aspect of understanding Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's something that's dynamic and expanding, that at the same time is deemed to come from a moment in history. So the reason that is difficult is that if you have that God, like with the Sefer Torah, God gave the Sefer Torah. Believe it, you don't believe it, but if you believe it, then you say this is the word of God, and it's concrete, it's clear. This is the word of God. Bereshit bara Elokim, and so forth. What occurs with Torah Sheba'al Peh is that it's an entity that you can't specifically state that this specific word or this specific part of it came from God to Moshe. In other words, the idea that Torah Sheba'al Peh is concrete statements. Instead of writing down ABC, God said ABC to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so you sit there and say, why did he write it down? But okay, but I understand it. So ABC is concrete, God gave to Moshe. Fine, now I understand. But the point is that we're also saying that Torah Sheba'al Peh is dynamic, expanding. Therefore, you can't specifically state that this statement, ABC, was stated from God to Moshe. What was given is an entity that allowed for this statement, or that created the possibility that this statement would be stated, and when that statement was made, it is considered to have its authority from Har Sinai. It's a lot more difficult to explain. It's like saying that, well, let me give you an example to try and explain this. I'm not giving this as a perfect example, I'm sort of giving this as an idea. When Einstein said E equals mc squared, right? Okay? What was he really saying? Did he invent E equals mc squared? No. What did he do? What he basically stated is a scientific axiom that existed since creation, he uncovered. So the truth is when was E equals mc squared created? It's created at Bereshit. Okay?
Created when?
At Bereshit, right? Einstein was the one who said E equals mc squared. So that's an example of something where does E equals MC squared come from? It comes from God at creation. Okay. Let me give you another example. The electric light bulb.
Edison.
Edison. Correct. Where do you get it from? Well, when I could sit there and say the electric light bulb came from creation.
Yeah.
Right?
From
because
electricity.
Because all Edison did was take the rules of creation, applied it, and came up with the electric light bulb. So I could sit there and say, where does the electric light bulb really come from? It comes from creation. God never said it at creation. He never said E equals MC squared. He never said it at creation. All these other questions exist. So the point is that, but the fact is he came up with it. But him coming up with E equals MC with the light bulb does not mean that he defines creation. So if you say that, then if you look at Torah Sheba'al Peh, there were ideas in Torah Sheba'al Peh that were similar to the creation of the light bulb. There were ideas in Torah Sheba'al Peh that were similar to E equals MC squared. Okay, and those individuals who came up with these ideas, the halachic masters, who we would say were comparable to Einstein or Edison, where did they get the Torah Sheba'al Peh? Their statements of Torah Sheba'al Peh, what they did in Torah Sheba'al Peh, also came from Sinai, because the basic point of creation of Torah Sheba'al Peh is at Sinai. In terms of us, in terms of it being handed over.
There. It's just a matter of the explanation or expanding on it, or having it revealed.
Having it revealed, or coming up with an invention using its concepts or things of that nature.
Like Tehillim.
What?
Like Tehillim?
Well, Tehillim is different. When you start talking about the role of the rest of Tanakh with Torah, that's a little bit more complicated. Okay?
I mean, Tehillim is apparently a way of channeling energy.
Yes.
That you weren't able to do.
Right, but the fact is that Tehillim were statements that were made after the revelation at Sinai. So it's a different aspect of it. But the fact is when a person comes up with a chiddush in Torah Sheba'al Peh, of a deraisa in Torah Sheba'al Peh,
right, it's
similar to Edison coming up with an invention in the rules of in the world of creation. So that's perhaps a good example of trying to understand how Torah works, or how Torah Sheba'al Peh works. But the fact is trying to understand the entity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave over to Moshe Rabbeinu.
Is a verb, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That the entity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave over to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Which is the entity that is worked upon by the halachic scientists, that allows them to come up with new understandings of the principles, new definitions of the principles. The comes up with new inventions in Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's what it's difficult to do in terms of understanding what it was that was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu that allowed for this dynamic involvement in the process of Torah Sheba'al Peh. There's also another issue. Let's take the case of Newton. Before Einstein came up with E equals MC squared, people bought the laws of science of
gravity.
Newton. Well, that was one of the rules of Newton. The point is that down the road, when Einstein came around, he basically showed that something that Newton said was incorrect. Right? Now, the point is that the fact that Newton came up with something that was incorrect is expected. Why? Why is it it's not shocking that Newton could have made a mistake? Okay, well, the fact is Newton was a human being. And Newton can only work with the facts that he has. And Newton also, like every other human being, has limitations. Right. So the point is that in the realm of science, where they're always trying to figure out what's the real rules of nature, what really is going on. If scientists keep coming up with ideas, and then scientists can be disproven. And even with Newton's ideas, no one says Newton was wrong, Newton was about this, but the fact is that scientists can also make mistakes. For example, do you know how they used to deal with diabetes in the 1800s? You know what doctors used to do if they saw someone if they came to a conclusion that someone was diabetic? You know,
they'd amputate their limbs.
No, that's their gangrene. But the fact is what was the normative medical response?
Give them sugar.
Yeah, right. Because diabetes was an absence of sugar. They perceived diabetes as absence of sugar. Therefore, the medical response was to give them sugar, which we now know would be the worst thing you could do for a person who's in that situation.
Right.
A person who you know, okay, because the whole thing with
it has to be a regulated dose.
Well, it has to be also because of insulin. So the point is that and I'm not getting into medical reasons for this, but the point is human thought can be wrong. Okay, this is human. Okay, so this leads into one of the great difficulties people have with Torah Sheba'al Peh. The way I describe Torah Sheba'al Peh by comparing it to Einstein and Edison immediately brings into the equation that God, that human beings are involved in the process of understanding Torah Sheba'al Peh. Right?
Right.
Okay. People have problems with that. Why? Because human beings can be wrong.
Right.
So when I say that Torah Sheba'al Peh involves investigation and study, and has a certain aspect of expansion due to new ideas, the only way you get this dynamic, expansive view of Torah Sheba'al Peh is if the human being's involvement can have an effect. And that means the human being is involved in the process of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which means that the fallibility of the human being can be involved in Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay.
Yes.
A lot of people have problems with that. If Torah Sheba'al Peh was simply God said A, B, C, and a lot of people say, I want to only hear what God said. I don't want to hear what the rabbi said. Tell me what God said. But if I tell you that within Torah Sheba'al Peh there are elements where you have elements of what God said, but the fact is these elements that God said were then investigated, dealt with in an intellectual, in an analytical way by human beings. So the question exists, well, that means it's no longer the pure word of God, which also means that the fallibility of the human being can be involved. So a lot of people therefore have problems with a Torah Sheba'al Peh that has this possibility of human involvement.
Right. What if a certain rabbi has a certain biased opinion and bases
that's all part of the question, because you're basically saying once you bring human beings into the equation, then it's no longer the pure voice of God.
Right.
It seems to be, but the belief of Torah Sheba'al Peh is God intended.
Like the Cherem Rabbinic Gershon on mixed marriages, my grandfather, multi-wise, my grandfather believed or thought apparently that he was biased because he didn't have a great relationship with women.
But by the way, the question you're raising is a further question, because the fact is that then you get into the self evaluation and self-critique to limit subjective involvement. See, when you start bringing in issues of sociological or psychological bias, you start getting much more into the conservative view of halacha. Okay, and that's the historical school, conservative view of halacha, which states much more emphatically that these biases play a role in halacha, and therefore that's why the conservative Judaism has greater flexibility. In other words, let me step back for a second. It's important to recognize that conservative Judaism believes itself to be a halachic entity. It believes that it is applying the rules of halacha in its decisions. The point is that its understanding of the halachic system is different than an Orthodox perspective. The original distinction between the early conservatives and the Orthodox was in many ways hard to define, okay? And that's why when you deal with historical figures from the conservative movement, it's hard to really sit there and say this person wasn't Orthodox, or because that dividing line was more unclear.
What was the dividing line back then, initially?
It was methodology and halachic decision making. In other words, it was how you made a halachic decision, but it was clearly a halachic decision. It was clearly, quoting from Meforshim and stuff like that, it was clearly very much a halachic decision. The point is that it was felt by the majority of Orthodox thinkers that there was a line that was crossed in that halachic decision.
In terms of leniency?
It's not just leniency, it's actually methodology. Let me give you an example.
A lot of medical stuff.
Well, let me give you an example. Let's say driving to Shul on Shabbos. Okay, which the conservative movement came out and said it's okay to drive to Shul on Shabbos, right? What was their halachic argument? Well, people they just said, well, society changes, therefore it's okay. That's not a halachic argument. What was their halachic argument? So the fact is their halachic argument was actually, I'm not exactly sure of this because I've heard two different arguments, but the way I first heard it is that in driving to Shul on Shabbos, one of the problems it was turning on the key and driving to Shul, okay? All the malachas that come out from driving to Shul on Shabbos, they defined as grummas, okay? As grummas. A grumma is a causative behavior. In other words, when you deal with grumma is like the game they had for kids, Mousetrap.
Yeah.
Where you do this and it causes this, causes that, so forth and so forth.
Right.
That's called a grumma. Okay. So grummas have a different halachic category in certain ways, and in certain ways,
like opening a fridge.
That's a good example. Right. If you turn on the light when you open up the fridge, there's a question of whether that's a grumma, because you don't turn on. The truth is, it depends how you did it.
I'm not talking about turning on the light. Even turning on the fridge.
You're right. Exactly.
The motor will end up.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
If you open up the fridge, eventually the
fridge will warm up a little more,
and then eventually they'll
same with the oven.
So same with the oven and same with that.
So we don't look at it that way.
But the truth of the matter is, and therefore people say you should do this, and some people only open up a fridge if the motor is on and stuff like that. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that also applies to opening a door in the house. in the winter.
Right.
It will turn on the furnace. Okay.
Yeah.
That is a grama. Okay. Now wait a sec. The fact is gramas. And I don't want to get technically or whatever about gramas, but in many cases, gramas are only drabonans. They're still aser, but they're drabonans. Okay. Now, the conservative rabbis who said it's okay to drive to shul on Shabbos said
that was halachic ruling.
Their halachic argument, which was not an acceptable halachic argument for various reasons, but their halachic argument was, I'm not saying this as an example of a correct halachic argument, I'm saying this as an example of what conservative Judaism did with halacha and your question about the bias of human beings. But the point is, the conservative movement was much more accepting of the bias of human beings, which allowed them greater leniency. They said it was okay. But the example would be is that they said that driving a car on Shabbos, the ceremony are only gramas, and they put the gramas in the category of put in the category of drabbanans, and then they said, and we have a principle that says l'sorach mitzvah, okay, shvus is in great necessities. L'sorach mitzvah, shvus is nisr drabbanan and Shabbos is permitted l'sorach mitzvah. Therefore, the original conservative tshuva was, if you want to daven in shul with the minyan, you can go to the minyan that's closest to you, right? In other words, you can be over the drabbanans of driving your car in order to do the mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibur. Okay? Okay. What? No, the old drabbanans. You can be
tzibur again?
Congregational davening to have a minyan. Okay, but you can only go to the shul that's closest to you. That was the original tshuva of the conservatives. Was you could drive to shul, the closest shul, and the argument is that driving to shul is only Nisr Drabanan. Nisr Drabanan Nisr Drabanan is a tzorach mitzvah, tzorach great mitzvah, okay. That was their halachic. The halachic argument was
not to get technical, but they are right. It is a
the fact of the matter is, it's not so simple. The truth of the matter is, it really isn't so simple.
I'm not saying it could be excused because it's just derabbanah.
The fact that the fact is that there's arguments about the grama nature of it. Okay. There's arguments about even there's arguments even with the argument that even if it's mitzvah, even if it's a drabanan, not every drabanan can be overruled because of sorach mitzvah. So the truth of the matter is that it is. I'm not giving the example of a correct halachic argument. I'm just trying to say they use the language.
It would be like a deraisa on Shabbos.
Deraisa on Shabbos?
Yeah.
Breaking coriander seeds with a mortar and pestle.
That's what that's for. Okay, why are you breaking it? To define a deraisa, if
it's for food, it's allowed?
No, well, it's not so simple. The fact of the matter is, it depends what the reason is, and the fact is, defining this as deraisa, you have to also have the idea of what its purpose was. And is it just if it's just to destroy them? And Hilchos Shabbos are very complicated. That's why I don't want to deal with the actual Hilchos Shabbos issue.
What I'm asking is there like a chance at Shabbos where you'll have a deraisa that like a derabanan that. You can't do deraisa unless you override a derabanan, which you can do.
No,
you can't.
No, wait a sec. You're saying that there's a lot of derabanans that protect you from ever being over deraisa. Okay? The fact is that may be real, that we have so much protections that enable us to never even get involved in having to deal with deraisas. But a person could be over deraisas on Shabbos. If a person lights a fire on Shabbos, it's a deraisa. The point is, if for the purpose of creating that fire, well, it depends what that purpose is. But the point is that the idea. All I'm trying to say, I don't want to get involved in the details here. I'm trying to say that the conservative movement gave an argument using the language of halacha within their definitions. That's all I want to say.
And they did it within halacha. So
no.
They did it within their understanding of
halacha.
Right.
So hold on. So if let's say you had a Kiev rabbi who said it is better to...
No, don't go there. The fact of the matter is from an Orthodox perspective, it's not a good psak.
Right.
Okay. In other words, it's saying if the conservative movement said that swordfish is kosher.
Right.
Okay. You're asking me. I'd sit there and say no, swordfish is not kosher. Orthodoxy said swordfish is not kosher, and therefore you can't sit there and say that's another shita. It's not a shita.
Right.
It's the same. You have to sit there and say it's the same as a Reform rabbi saying that pork is permitted.
So
a little bit different. It's a little different. But the fact is, and you can't apply conservative rabbis today to what I'm talking about in the 1800s. I'm trying to say that the original movement, the conservative movement, used halacha, and the original workers of the conservative movement, when they used halacha, that dividing line in how they shifted the principles was harder to define. So there were people that some Orthodox people considered totally epicurus, and other people in the Orthodox world said, no, he's not an epicurus. Don't necessarily agree with him, but big Talmud Chacham or whatever. But the fact is that the conservative movement today has moved to such an extent that it's not there. But the truth is, another example in terms of Shabbos is, as I saw someone said that the issue with the car focuses on the issue of Malchus Shesarach L'Gufa, Shmarach Shesarach L'Gufa. And
what does that mean again?
There's a definition. It's difficult. It's a definition in Hilchos Shabbos that a malacha to be asked in Hilchos Shabbos has to be for the purpose it was done in the Mishkan. That's considered to be a malacha shesarach l'gufa. This is for its purpose. A malacha that is not for that definition is considered to be, it's machlokes in the Gemara with this nisur d'oraisa also, but the fact is we paskin that it's nisur d'rabbanan. A malacha shesarach l'gufa is nisur d'rabbanan. Then the question arises of what exactly is malacha shesarach l'gufa, malacha shesarach l'gufa. So I heard one person say we follow a position of I think of Rashi. That's the way Shulchan Aruch holds. That basically that this is the definition of malacha shesarach l'gufa and so forth. So I read somewhere that the conservative movement based their definition of allowance on Shabbos, to drive on Shabbos, on a different Rishon's decision, the decision of what a malacha shesarach l'gufa was. Therefore said, according to this Rishon, it's malacha shesarach l'gufa. That put it into categories of drabbanans, and once it put in the categories of drabbanans, they said, okay, tzarach mitzvah.
So with other
so wait a sec. So the fact of the matter is, the conservative movement said, we have total play to take any Rishon. Okay? We can play with any Rishon.
What's Rishon again?
An early commentary from what? No. We're talking Rishon is from, let's say, 1,000 to 1,400. Let's say. So they say you can play.
So the Rishonim are before,
like Rashi.
The Achronim are
later.
Oh yeah.
Right. We're in the period.
So it has nothing to do with Mishnah Gemara. It has to do with
no, it's after that. So the fact of the matter is that they play with any Rishon that they want. Okay? Within Orthodoxy, okay, we have more limitations on the role of Rishonim and what Rishonim you can use, not use, the majority of Rishonim, which Rishonim have more weight, and so forth and so forth. The conservative movement was much more open to it. So, and one of the big things is also that we'll apply the Shulchan Aruch much more rigorously. So they basically said, no, we can pick from anyone. But the reason they say you can pick from anyone is really what I'm getting to.
Okay.
Is a lot of it, the reason they can say that is because they really believe much more, in a much greater way, in human bias in the halacha. So basically they're saying, listen, there's a lot of human bias, sociological bias and so forth and so forth. A lot of halachas were defined by the history, okay? So therefore, when we go back to looking at halacha, we can look, like you said, we can look at that Rav. He came up with that psak because that was the community he was living in. He had this attitude towards women. He had this attitude, blah 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 blah, and therefore, they basically said, and we have leeway also to apply our sociology, our ideas. The fact is, they still use some halachic language, right? But the fact is that they basically also they also accepted a greater amount of reality of human flexibility. The difference is what you said beforehand, is that's why people are very, very careful with mentioning bias in halacha. The fact is that human beings inherently are fallible.
Yes.
The fact is human beings inherently have a human bias. Okay? We are human beings. The point is that what is critical in an orthodox understanding of halacha is self-criticism and self-evaluation. So the point is that there's a remarkable intensity in halacha to deal with the human element. In other words, the reality is, first of all, there's the underlying issue that a Kodesh Baruch Hu gave over something at Har Sinai. Yeah. This thing which he gave over at Har Sinai involves human beings in its further development, and God intended it that way, and it has to involve human beings in its further development. However, given that there is a recognition that the human beings are to attempt to try and be as objective and as purely analytical as they can be. So therefore, there is an intent within halacha, within orthodoxy understanding halacha, of self-critique. So the point is that the fact is that you still have the human element.
Right.
So the point is that this is why I brought up the whole conservative thing. The conservative movement took the human element and said, hey, it's there, so we'll play with it much more. Yeah. The early conservative people, they accepted it to a certain extent. Yeah. But they were also very much out of this world. As conservative Judaism developed, okay, the allowance for the human element was much more involved. Now,
so like homosexuality,
right. So and that's it. So that's where you get into issues.
Like abandoning halacha.
No, but they still will try to
exploited the human element of Torah developing.
Of what they exploited the. They gave so much weight to any statement that was. In other words, what they did is they overextended the human element that was, in other words, because there was a human element. When you say the Rambam says, okay, so you say the Rambam says, well, or anyway, you say this person said this. So you sit there and say, well, he didn't have a good relationship with his wife, and he therefore didn't look very positively on women, and so forth and so forth, and that's why he said it. That was part of why he said it. That kind of argument allows for a greater type of flexibility in the argument. Now, is the argument
in Orthodox? Rambam was criticized.
No, wait a sec. Is the argument totally wrong? Right. Well, that's a big machlokus of Orthodox people. The fact of the matter is that there are people in the Orthodox world who would be adamant that chas v'sholom you should say that there was any subjectivity in any gadol. Okay, chas v'sholom you should say that any gadol was affected by his upbringing or by the country he was born in or something like that. I mean, the fact is there are people very adamant about this, and not only that, but there are people who because they're concerned about any aspect of the human element, they're much more comfortable with almost assigning a Ruach HaKodesh to a Posek. Posek has Ruach HaKodesh, he made this. God told him to.
Think so.
But no, there's real problems with that argument.
Yeah.
There's real problems with that argument. But the fact is that in Orthodoxy, there's an acceptance. There are people who have an acceptance of the reality of the human element. The only thing is that it is expected within orthodoxy that you are constantly challenging your human element. In other words, your objective is to try and be as objective as possible. But the fact is that from the question from a Kadosh Baruch Hu's viewpoint, the point is that Torah Sheba'al Peh does bring in the human element. So the question is, so what was that original Torah Sheba'al Peh entity that that then allowed for the development of the human element? And secondly, what do you do with the idea of the human element? So you have statements that are made in the halacha, and also we're going to see a statement from Moshe that basically says that if the human being makes a mistake, but he tried to do it to the best of his ability, then that's what then the halacha is what the human being stated as a conclusion. That's the behavior that God wants. And it's a famous story of Tanur Shlach Tnai. Famous story of Tanur Shlach Tnai is was Machlokas about Tumah and Tara between Rabbi Eliezer and this is more I believe in Baba Metzia, but
the Tanur?
What the Tanur?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's Machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And Rabbi Eliezer says he's right. And he says, if I'm right, let the walls start coming down. So Rabbi Yeshua says, what standing do the walls have in a halachic debate? So the walls immediately stopped. So and you had the first leaning tower, the leaning walls. And then Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm right, let the stream flow backwards. And then Rabbi Yeshua said, what does the stream have a statement in the halacha, in halachic arguments? The stream stop flowing backwards, basically. Okay. Then the baskol came. Then a baskol came out from the Shemayim.
What's a baskol?
The voice of God. Technically, it was a voice of God. So the baskol came out and said that in all halachas Rabbi Eliezer is right. So Rabbi Yeshua said it's lo b'shamayim. Torah is not in the hands of heaven anymore. Baskol has no standing in halacha. In other words, God has no standing in halacha anymore. God states that Rabbi Eliezer was right. That's what it. Baskol came out and said Rabbi Eliezer was right. Was basically understand to say that God was saying that Rabbi Eliezer was right. So Rabbi Yeshua said, doesn't matter. When God gave over the halachic process to man at Har Sinai, He basically said, it's now in your hands. Lo b'shamayim, it's no longer in the hands of heaven. Yeah. It's your decision, and therefore the halacha was
right.
So the halacha followed Rabbi Yeshua, and then the Gemara goes on to say that they ran into Eliyahu Navi, and they said to Eliyahu Navi, "What did the Kodesh Baruch Hu do when Rabbi Yeshua said Lo b'shamayim?" So he said, God laughed and said, My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. The point is, and you're going to see it, that we're going to see it from Moshe, that the fact is that the halacha doesn't state that the conclusions of human beings are going to be the infallible conclusions of what God would have said if He would have given over the details at Har Sinai. In other words, God gave over this entity and said, you work it out. All the things that human beings worked out are not necessarily what God meant at Har Sinai. It's hard to explain because if that's what came out, God obviously meant it on some level, but the fact is, it would not necessarily be what God had intended to be the conclusion at Har Sinai, applying our language. But the bottom line is, and we're going to see Moshe talk like this, is that, but we're supposed to follow the halacha as we worked it out, correctly, as we worked it out to the best of our abilities, and that God intended the human element. Okay, that's what Loba Shemayim is about. Now, the point is for a lot of people, they have difficulties with it. What the conservative movement did is by saying, hey, there's a human element, they expanded the human element and built upon it and came up with halachic conclusions that basically employs the human element more than is acceptable within halacha. Therefore, that's why they use the historical school. They'll say that decision was made because of this society and blah blah blah, and we have a new society, which means that they allowed for greater incorporation of the human element. The point is that the Orthodox perspective is that there's self-critique, self-evaluation that makes you try not to do that. But at the same point in time, we're human. We recognize there's a possibility of us not getting it right. But Loba Shemayim is a principle. It's a principle of rabbinic Judaism, as you say, that says this is what God intended. Now, that yields a very, very difficult understanding of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The first thing is, so what was it that God gave over that allowed for this human involvement? Okay? Obviously, God didn't just give over certain statements of law. In other words, when we talk about Torah Sheba'al Peh, He didn't just say, and there's this law, there's that law. We looked at the Rambam, we saw that God did do some things like that. He said, for example, that tefillin boxes are supposed to be, actually, tefillin straps are supposed to be black. The examples the Rambam used was by Sukkah. We know the minimum requirements of a Sukkah, so forth and so forth. That's Halacha Moshe Sinai, that's a statement of what God meant at Sinai. And the fact is, those statements were clearly the statements that God gave over at Sinai, and the Rambam says there was never machlokas in those statements. Those were clear-cut statements. So part of Torah Sheba'al Peh are absolute statements from God of laws. But there was another aspect of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is this aspect of Torah Sheba'al Peh that brings forth human involvement in analysis and investigation. So what exactly did God give over that was this other entity that allowed for greater human involvement? And that's difficult to define. Okay, it's difficult to define. And that's something I'll give you some ideas on. The second thing that happens about this is the acceptance that God felt it more important to have human beings involved in the analysis of Torah Sheba'al Peh than to get the infallible conclusions. In other words, what the key aspect of this principle is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying better to have human beings involved in figuring out Torah Sheba'al Peh than me giving over a clear-cut statement. And Moshe is going to make that statement also. Okay, we're referring to the Hakdama to the Igros Moshe.
This Rabbi Feinstein?
Right. Okay, he's actually going to ask that question. He's going to say, why didn't God just give us all the rules clear-cut? Okay. Now, so the point is, though...
Can you get up that tonight?
No, we're not going to do that tonight. We'll say we won't do Moshe tonight.
No.
The fact is, though, is what this leads up to... the fact what this leads up to is what was this entity that Kodesh Baruch Hu gave over. So, what we know is that, first of all, their ideas, their principles, there were other rules to be applied upon the laws that he gave over, like his Kal V'chomer. That if you had a rule like this in a minor law, then you can apply it to a major law. If you had a leniency in a major law, you can apply it to a minor law. That's a Kal V'chomer.
Argument.
Right. So the fact is that's why the concept referring to the Yud Gimel Midas Torah Nidreshet by him. There was also the fact that there was also ideas where the methodology of reading psukim, the fact that no pasuk has an extra word. If there's extra words, you're supposed to do drushes on it. And what I was getting into last week was the fact that we don't know the exact science of drushes. In other words, how does this extra letter or this extra word result in this law? Okay? We don't know how they got that law from that extra word. But it seems to be, and I believe it's from the Chazon Ish, that he said that there was a science of drushes, okay? And that science of drushes may have been lost at the time of the Gemara, or at the time of the Mishnah. I saw another argument that basically says that we don't know anymore in terms of why we can no longer argue with Gemaras, is because we don't know what laws are actually the statements made by God at Sinai, or what laws were derived through drushes.
So we don't know we don't know what Torah Sheba'al Peh really is.
We know that, but we know the statement is Torah Sheba'al Peh. We don't know if it was a statement. We don't know what Torah Sheba'al Peh given at Moshe Rabbeinu, the exact nature of Torah Sheba'al Peh given at Moshe Rabbeinu is. But we know that this is part of it. We don't know if this statement was actually part of that clear-cut rules, or whether it was through analysis. It's part of those clear-cut rules, and you can't argue with it. That's why we can't argue with Tanaim. I just saw recently in Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, where he basically says that the language that was used to express Torah in Torah Shebechtav, the language is primary. It's all language. You can't change a letter, right? In Torah Sheba'al Peh, he basically says that's what's primary is the ideas, and every generation had its own way of expressing itself, so that exactly the language of Torah Sheba'al Peh may have shifted over the generations in order to maintain the ideas. That's also a big issue. You were talking about the difference between learning Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. If you learn Torah Shebechtav, even if you don't understand what you're reading, it's considered to be a mitzvah of limud Torah. It's one of the reasons people learn Tehillim, or read Tehillim, is that a lot of reasons reading of Tehillim became something that people started doing was because, even if they didn't understand it, because it was part of Torah Shebechtav, we're talking about Tanakh, because it was written part of Tanakh, it had value as limud Torah, even if people didn't understand it. Torah Sheba'al Peh, if you just read a Gemara and don't understand it, it doesn't count as anything. Torah Sheba'al Peh is all about the understanding. So the fact is Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg says, in every generation, they used their language to express the ideas in the best possible way. You can think about this, how they would have expressed an idea in 1842 would be different than express the idea today, just because our language is different. So those are examples of aspects of Torah Sheba'al Peh.
What do you mean they express it differently? Like, so they talk about like
the language, the culture.
No, I'm talking about the way you express things. You use a word like, say you use a word like cool.
Mm-hmm.
You have a specific meaning for what cool means.
Right.
I understand what you're talking about. Okay? So the point is that as you talk, you express it in a way that I understand what you're talking about.
So you mean the slang of it?
No, I'm just
the figures of speech.
the way you express the idea.
Right.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in the Gemara, like about like the Persians, about the French.
So the point is you're trying to express the idea.
Right.
So the point is you're not as mukbid as you would be with Torah Shebechtav in terms of the word. Okay. So the point is that Torah Sheba'al Peh was an entity that was given over at Har Sinai that demanded human involvement to fully comprehend its breadth and depth. Some statements were clear-cut. Most, maybe the majority, was not clear-cut. In order to uncover what is the breadth and depth of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is always growing, it's considered to be like infinitesimal. Like infinity, no parameters on it. The point is that the human being has to be involved. So the human mind has to unlock the breadth and depth of Torah Sheba'al Peh. This entity HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave over to Har Sinai, which we cannot actually state in clear terms the nature of that original entity that God came over Har Sinai for a variety of reasons, even the language reason. Okay, but the point is that that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intent was. With that intent raises the issue of what about human fallibility, and that's a real issue. But it seems to be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is willing to say, listen, even given human fallibility, that was my intent, and that it's more important to have human beings involved in uncovering Torah Sheba'al Peh, even given human infallibility. Okay, with all and with all the issues of human fallibility, including the issue that arose with the conservative movement, where human fallibility may have been extended even beyond the parameters that were acceptable within halacha. So the point is that was really it. But the fact is that trying to define that line of what's it's really hard stuff to define that line of the real. It's not just simply is it human fallible, it's not human fallible, but you have a statement that's made, and you're saying there's other issues involved in this as well. And you really see that the dividing line between conservative and orthodox, especially in its early years, was pretty hard to define. Like I saw one thing where there was an issue, and there was an issue about one Gemara, and a Rishon gave an answer that this Gemara was unique, and the language that was used in this Gemara was very different. And then I saw someone else involved in the historical school. I read about someone else involved in the historical school who said we can take this idea and apply it to answer other Gemaras, and which would seem to be, hey, this Rishon said it by this one Gemara, so did the Rishon mean only by that one Gemara, or can you use it to extend to other Gemaras? And this person who said it was involved in the historical school, and he was controversial because some people felt that he crossed the line. And one of the reasons they felt he crossed the line is because he took this statement as Rishon and applied it where the Rishon didn't apply it. Okay, so the point is, but there's other people who felt, okay, well, once you have the Rishon applying in one case, maybe you can apply it. Maybe there's reasons
not. What, the same Rishon that wrote the Gemara said you can't apply it, or
the Rishon? There was a problem in one Gemara. Okay, in terms of the language in one Gemara. This Rishon answered it by saying that the language that the Gemara uses in this one case is not the regular way it uses this language. Okay, he states that. Okay, then there's someone who tried to give the same argument and said, and therefore you could see when this language is used in other cases may also not mean the way that language is usually used, which this Rishon never said. There was a problem in applying in this Gemara of using the regular understanding of this language. There was a problem. So therefore, he said, okay, it doesn't mean that in that case. This person came around and said, once you see that the Gemara doesn't use it in that, so maybe you can apply it in other cases.
How do you apply anything?
Okay, wait a second. You're missing the point. The point is that this language means something throughout the Gemara.
Right.
There's one case where if you say the language means that, you have a problem.
Right.
So Rishon says in this case, the answer is
this specific case.
In this specific case.
You said originally the mechanics of
right, but the fact is that but then this guy applied it and said, well, maybe in other cases it also didn't mean that. Okay, now the point is you're arguing and correct. So well, isn't that normative to apply one idea to another? The fact is that there were people who said, no, this guy is outside the pale. That answer is unacceptable, and therefore he's an apikoros. Other people said, not that they agreed with him, but they said it's not necessarily apikoros. That's the kind of issues you had in the original movement of the conservative movement. Okay? Right. And then it got more and more, evasive and more different, and so. And the fact is that it became. But one of the reasons they could do that is because there was more flexibility, because they involved the greater allowance for human fallibility in the system. Okay, so the point is that we're not here to talk conservative Judaism. I'm just giving an example. The point is I'm trying to give an example that it's an issue of dealing in halacha with the fact that there is a human element.
Yeah.
There's a movement, and therefore one of the reactions to conservative Reform Judaism was an entrenching in Orthodoxy, where you did have people who tried to define that poskim in Orthodoxy had Ruach HaKodesh. So therefore you remove the human fallibility. Okay, so that's a way.
But that's a false argument for the Orthodoxy.
Yes, in many people it's a false argument.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So do we apply that, or do we?
No.
So do we look at people, or do we not look at people?
From my perspective, there are problems. Actually, problems with saying from the Gemara's Elos B'Shemayim and other things like that.
Yeah.
There are problems with saying that a posek is applying Ruach HaKodesh.
Right. Well, also, what about when Rambam was criticized for things he wrote in more Nebuchim, or
that's the whole point. When simple answers to issues, like saying it was sociological, it was this, and so forth and so forth. Usually, from an Orthodox perspective, you don't go with simple answers because you basically recognize that in Orthodoxy there was always a self-evaluation and self-critique to that analysis. So the point is that, listen, the Vilna Gaon said that some statement, not only Vilna Gaon, the Rambam thought. Give you an example. The Rambam thought very negatively of sexuality. Okay? Yeah. He basically did not give sexuality a value. He basically said it's a human drive. Human beings have to satisfy the human drives. They have to eat and so forth and so forth. Therefore, they have to satisfy the human drives. But don't think that there's some kind of special spiritual value in sexuality. Okay? Sexuality has nothing to do with spirituality. It's a sefer called Igeres HaKodesh, who basically says, a sefer called Igeres HaKodesh, which was basically assumed to be written by the Ramban. So you're talking big stuff. Okay, now there's arguments that the Igeres HaKodesh wasn't written by the Ramban, but the Igeres HaKodesh was taken as a very important sefer. It was basically a sefer on sexuality. It's a sefer that a lot of people look at before they get married. Okay? In it, he basically says that there's a value in sexuality. He says sexuality has a spiritual value.
Who was first again, Ramban or Rambam?
The Rambam was before.
Rambam was before the Ramban.
The Rambam was before the Ramban.
Okay.
So the Ramban critiques the Rambam. The Igeres HaKodesh critiques the Rambam. And he says that the Rambam's attitude towards touching, which includes sexuality, he was influenced by Aristotle. So he makes that statement.
Who was gay? But not that it has anything to do with it.
But the fact is, he was influenced by a non-Jewish source.
Yeah, okay.
And he argues, of course, sexuality has value because sexuality was existent before, was existence from creation, because Adam and Chava had their kids before they ate from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. In other words, Adam and Chava mated before the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. That tells you that sexuality is created by God. Therefore, it must have spiritual value. It must have a purpose. So therefore, he's saying the Rambam was affected by Aristotle. That kind of argument, a lot of people get very angry about it. What do you mean? The Rambam didn't check. So the point is that that's the kind of argument you have to deal with.
Sorry, could you just recap? I didn't get the correlation between the Rambam, Aristotle, and Adam and Chava.
Okay. The Rambam had a very negative attitude towards sexuality. Okay. The Rambam died in, let's say, 1200. Okay. I think the Ramban died around 1300. Okay. In the Sefer Igeres HaKodesh, okay, which a lot of people say was written by the Ramban, but was from let's say from after the Rambam. He wants to deal with sexuality, and he basically wants to have he presents an argument that sexuality has spiritual value. One of his arguments is sexuality was created by God. And it was not a result of Adam and Chava eating from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. It was created by God, and in fact, Adam and Chava were sexual before they ate of the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, because Cain and Hevel were born before they ate from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. Okay. So the point is that it's an argument that sexuality is purely created by God, therefore it must be good. Okay.
It's godly.
Okay, it's godly. So within the confines of proper halacha.
Right.
So the Rambam basically says that so the Geras HaKodesh basically says that the Rambam got his was affected by Aristotle, and Aristotle had a negative view of of touching. Regardless of his behavior, he didn't think highly of the senses. He thought human touch was the lowest sense. So he said the Rambam was affected by Aristotle. Now, so the point is how do you deal with that statement? So that's the kind of statement that deals with human fallibility and taking it very seriously. A lot of people have problems with the Geras HaKodesh saying that about the Rambam and defend the Rambam. On the other hand, was he affected by Aristotle? So the truth is that leads to a whole variety of issues. The point is that we don't downplay the fact that there is a human element in Torah Sheba'al Peh. What the conservatives did was extended it. But the fact is but the point is we have to live with it. And
How?
people,
I'm confused.
that's going to be what we have to look at. Okay, that's what we're going to have to talk about in future shurim. How do we understand the human element in Torah Sheba'al Peh? All I want to do tonight is express that there is an issue, that when Kodesh Baruch Hu gave over, demanded human involvement in order to get the full breadth and depth of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay? With that human involvement also comes human fallibility. So therefore, Torah Sheba'al Peh includes the human element with the weakness with its weakness. So how do we limit that weakness? And that's a question of halacha. How do we deal with it?
Where do you draw the line? Before it becomes a slippery slope like the conservatives.
Right. So how do you deal with these issues and so forth? But the point is, I told you that people were always very self-critical, self-analytical, but also in terms of understanding Torah Sheba'al Peh, how do we understand the nature of Torah Sheba'al Peh that has this human element? And that's what I want to look at in terms of the Hagdama of Rav Moshe, because Rav Moshe is basically going to say, yes, there's a human involvement. Okay, this is what the human involvement is. These are the parameters on the human involvement. This is what is demanded of the human involvement. And this is also what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intent was. Okay?